Manuel, there is too much butter on those trays. ¿Qué? There is too much butter on those trays. No, señor, not on those trays. Uno, dos, tres. An absolute classic British sitcom, one might say the grandfather of almost all modern sitcoms, Fawlty Towers. Yes, we're going all the way back to the 1970s for this one, because it turns out that there is in fact a German dub available for this sitcom, called Das verrückte Hotel in German, literally the crazy hotel. Unfortunately, the German dub is slightly disappointing. They tried their very best, but it's extremely difficult, or perhaps even impossible, to find a voice actor who can match the energy that John Cleese and the rest of this cast brought to this show. And many of the jokes simply don't work without an English accent. The humor is very British. Still, they tried their best, so let's take a look at a few translation successes and failures from the 12 original episodes of this show. Manuel, go to the water tank on the roof. Water on roof in tank. 2 dead pigeons in water tank. Take out. What is funny? How they get up there? Well, they flew up there. Oink, oink, oink. Not pigs, pigeons. Pigeon. Like your English. The pun here revolves around the word pigeon, which is either a type of bird or, with the same pronunciation but a different spelling, can also refer to a grammatically simplified version of a language, the type spoken by non-native speakers. The problem is that this particular pun doesn't work in German, so the translation team had to pick a different type of animal that could also serve as an insult. So instead of pigeons, in the German version they changed it to Spatzen, the German word for sparrow. Manuel mishears this as Katzen, the German word for cat, and is understandably confused as to how 2 cats got into the water tank. But how do we work in the insult at the end? Let's watch the last part of that scene in German. Nein, Spatzen, keine Katzen. Spatzen. Du Spatzenhirn. Spatzenhirn literally means sparrow brain. The insinuation is that someone has a brain the size of a sparrow's brain, meaning that they're not very smart. In English, you might say bird brain, although that's pretty old-fashioned. So the scene still works, though the translation team had to change the pun a little bit to make it all fit. Let's take a look at another pun that had to be adjusted slightly in order to work in German. So you would both like the veal. Oh, the veal's off, I'm afraid. How can it be? You've only just started it. I'm sorry, but the veal is in fact off. Well, it was never actually on. Honestly, that's a misprint. A misprint? Yes, it should say eel. Eel? Here we have another pun that had to be modified slightly, but the scene still works once the change is in place. In English, Basil claims that veal is a misprint and should have been eel, but this particular pun wouldn't work in German, as the word for veal is Kalb, or Kalbfleisch. So the translation team looked for a pun on the word Kalb and decided on the adjective kalt, meaning cold. So in German, Basil claims that Kalbschnitzel is a misprint and should have been Kaltschnitzel, which has an equivalent comedy value in German. But sometimes, despite their best efforts, the translation team is simply unable to come up with an equivalent pun in German to match the one in English. Let's look at an example of a failed pun translation. The veal is delicious and nutritious. In fact, one might say it's veally good. Veally good. That was a really bad pun, and unfortunately the translation team couldn't find a way to make it work in German, so they just had Basil repeat the same line twice. Das Kalbfleisch schmeckt gut und ist gesund, schmeckt gut und ist gesund, ungesund. The joke is just completely deleted and the scene moves on without one. Sometimes this is unavoidable, especially with wordplay, because there's often simply no translation available in the target language. Let's look at another example. That's puke, that is. Well, at least it's fresh puke. Oh God, you're dumb. He's very clever and rather highly strung. Yes, he should be. My favorite joke of the whole series. Highly strung can of course mean energetic, animated, or excited, but there's another possible meaning here. Highly strung can also refer to the process of stringing someone up, or hanging them from the neck until they are dead, as they used to do in the Old West. Basil is therefore insinuating that the misbehaving boy should be executed. Now the problem is that this expression doesn't work in German, so the translation team had to insert a different joke here, and, well, let's watch the last part of that scene again in German. Ist hochintelligent und wahnsinnig sensibel. Das ist auch kein Wunder bei diesen Eltern. So the joke now is that Basil is taking a potshot at their parenting ability, or lack thereof, in having raised such a poorly behaved brat. Still kind of funny, but not quite as funny as threatening to murder a small child. Now, the interesting part about translation failures like this is that sometimes it actually works out to the translation team's advantage if they can substitute in a joke that's as good as, or sometimes even better than, the original joke. Let's see an example of this. Here is your new menu. Duck with orange, duck with cherry, duck surprise. What's duck surprise? That's duck without orange or cherry. I mean, is this all there is? Duck? Yes, done of course in 3 extremely different ways. And what do you do if you don't like duck? Well, if you don't like duck, you're rather stuck. Okay, not bad. Basil comes up with an off-the-cuff rhyme in response to the customer's question, and it's reasonably funny. The only problem is that the rhyme wouldn't work in German, so again, the translation team had to think up a new joke to insert into the scene. Let's watch the last part again in German. Sagen Sie mal, ist das etwa alles? Gibt es nur Ente? Ja, aber natürlich in 3 ganz verschiedene Arten zubereitet. Und was empfehlen Sie, wenn man keine Ente mag? Naja, in solchen Fällen empfehle ich ein anderes Lokal. So, instead of the rhyme, the exchange was modified a little bit so that the customer asks, what do you recommend if someone doesn't like duck? To which Basil replies, well, in such cases I would recommend another restaurant. The new joke in German is at least as funny as the rhyme was in English. But translating a comedy screenplay is more than just working with puns and wordplay. Sometimes there are options for expressing something in German that wouldn't work in English, and so the resulting translation is perhaps not literally word for word, but still captures the essence of what was said. This can be educational for language learners because it's a neat way of picking up new vocabulary items and or new ways of expressing yourself in German. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Now I'm going to fetch my belongings and I do not expect to receive a bill. A perfectly simple line of dialogue from an unsatisfied customer. But let's hear that line again, this time in German. Ich werde jetzt meine Sachen holen und wehe, ich bekomme eine Rechnung von Ihnen. The line in English is pretty simple. I do not expect to receive a bill. But in German, the customer says, wehe, ich bekomme eine Rechnung von Ihnen. The word wehe in German is related to the word woe in English. Not woe as in woe Nelly, but rather woe as in woe to you or woe betide you. These expressions are extremely antiquated in modern English, but the Germans still use the word wehe. In modern English, you could say, don't you dare bill me for this, or you'll be sorry if I get a bill for this. Both of those can be expressed in German also. Wagen Sie es nicht, mir dafür eine Rechnung zu geben. Or, Sie werden es bereuen, wenn Sie mir dafür eine Rechnung geben. But wehe is also a perfectly good option in German, even though the equivalent English would sound extremely old-fashioned. Let's see another example of choosing a different word in German. You could have had both jobs done by now if you hadn't spent the whole morning skulking in there listening to that racket. Racket? That's Brahms! Brahms' third racket! The word racket in English usually refers to a piece of sporting equipment, like a tennis racket or a badminton racket. But racket can also refer to a loud, annoying noise. Sybil is therefore insulting Basil's musical selection, to which Basil takes great offense. The problem is translating the slang word racket into German. The translation team went with the word Gefiedel, which literally means to play something on a fiddle. Sybil is still insulting Basil's musical selection, but the wording is slightly different in German. Now, rarely a joke that was originally written for an English language screenplay can actually work better in the translated language. This doesn't happen very often, but it's usually pretty good when it does happen. Let's look at a couple of examples. Here we are, coffee pour vous. Pour vous? Pas pour toi? Oh, well, I'll probably have one later. Here's a clever joke that hinges on the fact that there are 2 ways of saying for you in French. Pour vous is the formal register and pour toi is used among friends. Mrs. Penoir is slightly offended that Basil is speaking formally to her instead of in a more friendly way because she's been flirting with him for the entire episode. Interestingly, this joke works better in the German translation than in the original English because the German language also has multiple ways of saying for you depending on formality. Für Sie would be the formal register, whereas Mrs. Penoir would likely prefer to hear für dich. This joke is lost in English because in English all of these phrases would simply translate as for you. Let's look at another example of this. Sorry, I didn't catch the names. Oh, you didn't? What a rotten bit of luck. No, we still don't know the names. Fawlty, Basil Fawlty. No, their names. I'm so sorry, I thought you meant mine, haha. Basil is nervous and botches what should have been a simple introduction between 2 couples. But now let's watch that last part again in German. Nein, nein, wir wissen nur noch immer nicht, wie Sie heißen. Fawlty, Basil Fawlty. Nein, nein, wie Sie heißen. Ach, Sie, es tut mir leid. Ich dachte, Sie meinten mich, haha. This scene works better in German simply because of the word Sie. It turns out the word Sie can have a bunch of different meanings depending on context. It can mean she, it can mean they, and it can also mean you if you capitalize the S. But of course, in the spoken language, you can't see capital letters. So when the man says, wir wissen nur noch immer nicht, wie Sie heißen, Basil misunderstands that as wie Sie heißen, as in we still don't know what you're called. So he replies with Fawlty, Basil Fawlty. The man then has to repeat himself and stress wie Sie heißen while pointing at the other couple so that it's clear that he's saying we still don't know what they're called. This is actually a mistake that can happen here and there in German because the three different usages of Sie are all identical in pronunciation, and the third person plural and second person formal take the same verb conjugation. So sometimes, particularly in the spoken language, it's necessary to point or gesture to differentiate between you and they. Now, before we close this episode, let's look at a couple of tragic examples where the original joke is just utterly lost in the German version. Sometimes, as we've seen, this is unavoidable for linguistic reasons, because a pun or wordplay simply doesn't translate. But other times, it's almost as though the translation team didn't understand the original joke and so end up translating it incorrectly. Let's see an example of that. I expect to be able to see the sea. You can see the sea, it's over there between the land and the sky. I'd need a telescope to see that. Well, may I suggest you consider moving to a hotel closer to the sea, or preferably in it. Perfect example of dry British wit, suggesting that the old lady should drown herself in the sea instead of complaining about the view from her hotel room. But let's hear that last part again in German. Das zu erkennen, brauche ich ein Teleskop. In dem Fall würde ich Ihnen vorschlagen, zu erwägen, in ein Haus zu ziehen, das näher am Meer liegt. Oder ein Hausboot vielleicht. For whatever reason, the translation team seems to have missed the original joke, and now Basil is advising her to move onto a houseboat. Maybe it's just me, but I think the visual of this old lady walking physically into the sea so that Basil doesn't have to hear her complaints anymore is just funnier. And finally, let's look at one last translation tragedy. This one was kind of unavoidable just due to the nature of the scene. In this episode, a bunch of Germans are coming to stay at the hotel, and some of them don't speak English. Basil claims to be able to speak German, but very quickly finds himself in over his head when a couple of these German guests approach him with a very simple request. Wir wollen ein Auto mieten, which means we'd like to rent a car. Wir wollen ein Auto mieten. Little bit tricky. Would you mind saying it again? Repeat. Wir. Well, we'll come back to that. Wollen. Voluntary? Ein Auto mieten. Auto. Oh, I see. You're volunteering to go out to get some meat. Not necessary. We have meat here. We have meat here in the building. Now, in Basil's defense, he was hit on the head earlier this episode and is suffering from a concussion. Still, that's a fantastically awful attempt at parsing out what they were asking him. Now, the problem is, how do we translate this into German? The usual tactic when translating German characters in English shows is simply to say they're from some other country like Denmark so that they can still speak a foreign language. But in this episode, it's relevant to the plot later on that these people are specifically from Germany, so now we have a problem when we want to translate this scene into German. Let's see what the translation team came up with. Wir wollen ein Auto mieten. Tja, das ist gar nicht so einfach. Und was für ein? Wir, Sie, damit sind Sie ganz bestimmt gemeint. Wollen, naja schon, was will denn nur? Ein Auto mieten. Ein Auto mieten? Ah, ich verstehe, Sie haben kein Geld, sich ein Auto zu kaufen, Sie wollen eins mieten. Das geht hier leider nicht, denn wir sind kein Autoverleih. Hier verleihen nur Schiffe. Wir haben Schiffe hier im Keller und auf dem Dach. Oof, that was painful. Yes, the translation team had a tough situation here, and maybe there just wasn't much they could have done. I don't know. I guess they decided to go with the fact that Basil is suffering from a concussion from earlier in the episode, and so he just starts spouting gibberish about renting boats. I'm not even going to go through it line by line, it's just too painful. Now, there were a handful of other such failures throughout the series, but this episode is getting quite long as it is, so let's leave it there. Now, before we go, a quick note about Andrew Sachs, the actor who played Manuel, the Spanish waiter. It turns out that Andrew Sachs was a native speaker of German, and so of the original cast, he was the only one capable of providing his own character's voice for the German dub. I wasn't able to confirm this, but according to IMDb, he said that the hardest part of doing so was trying to speak flawed German with a Spanish accent. Now, I can't play the actual audio here for legal reasons, but I can confirm that he did a very good job of it. As Basil might say, Manuel, brilliant!